Mahmoud Khalil was taken, moved across state lines secretly, and is now facing deportation from the United States. Not because he committed a crime, but because the U.S. government is saying that his presence or activities are bad for U.S. foreign policy. And now they're keeping him in Louisiana. And this is being done purposefully because it's more likely that judges there will side with the government's argument that he should be deported. Now, the government is using a rarely invoked section of immigration law under the Immigration and Nationality Act to justify the fact that he should be deported. Section 237A1C4 of the Immigration and Nationality Act basically says that the Secretary of State has the power to declare someone deportable from the United States if their presence or activities have a potentially serious adverse impact on foreign policy. Now, this section of law is very vague, very opaque, and extremely dangerous. It doesn't require that the government prove that you committed a crime. It doesn't even require you to be a national security threat. All it takes is a letter from the Secretary of State to basically say that you're a foreign policy problem, and that's enough to try to deport you. Now, there is an immigration case that dealt directly with this law. It's a 1999 case where a high-ranking Mexican official was deported using this very law. But the key difference is that in that case, the Mexican official had been convicted of money laundering, and he was accused of corruption at the highest levels in government in Mexico. In that case, the U.S. government had a high interest in having him deported, and that was because Mexico wanted him to be extradited. In this case, Mahmoud Khalil has no criminal convictions, not here in the U.S. or not abroad. There's no foreign government requesting his removal from the United States. And critically, the U.S. government has not presented a single piece of evidence linking him to any foreign policy threat. Secretary of State Marco Rubio came on Face the Nation today and basically tried to make all of the arguments as to why this is all justifiable. First, he said that Mahmoud Khalil lied when he failed to disclose his intentions of coming to the United States. If he had disclosed on his visa application that he was actually coming here because he was quote-unquote pro-Hamas, then he says the U.S. would have never let him in. But it's really important to know there are no requirements on a visa application to declare your political beliefs. The First Amendment protects free speech on U.S. soil, regardless of whether the person is a citizen of the country or not. And there's no precedent that requires a visa applicant to list every political opinion that they're going to have one day. And he's basically saying that support for Palestine or criticism of Israel is inherently pro-terrorist, which is an unfounded and dangerously vague claim to make. It would also be legally absurd to have students declare all of the political activism that they may engage in down the road when applying for a visa. And even in this interview today, he was not able to say what Mahmoud Khalil has done in order to justify his detention. But what's interesting is that the law itself also has a statutory exception. And that exception is basically that if someone's past, current, or future political beliefs or statements are lawful within the United States, then they cannot be deported under this law. The only way that they could be deported under this law is if the Secretary of State themselves personally makes a determination that the individual's presence in the United States would compromise a compelling U.S. foreign policy interest. So again, with no evidence of what Mahmoud Khalil has done, all of his activities that we know of are lawful. Marco Rubio went on to say that Mahmoud Khalil was a negotiator or a key spokesperson for people who engaged in vandalism and other kinds of disruptive behavior on college campuses. And I think this is an insanely weak argument because being a negotiator is not a crime. If anything, being a negotiator is a sign of de-escalation, not one of criminality. Does this mean that Martin Luther King Jr. was a criminal because he organized protests that disrupted the status quo? And again, I know under this law, you don't necessarily have to have been convicted of a crime in order to face deportation, and that the justification ultimately is also national security. But sometimes national security is used as a broad excuse to justify civil liberties violations. Ultimately, this whole case is setting a terrifying precedent potentially. It's essentially criminalizing speech on very vague standards, which can be arbitrarily applied to any non-citizen who's criticizing U.S. foreign policy. And it also gives the government the ability to silence dissenters under the guise of an adverse foreign policy impact. And unfortunately, where we are right now, Marco Rubio and the rest of the U.S. government is essentially redefining the visa process. But visas do not come with an ideological loyalty test. And if we continue to accept this, the U.S. government could justify deporting anyone who criticizes its foreign policy, whether that be journalists, professors, scholars, doctors, and the like.